Are you serious? You can't be serious, George Luckett hissed when Reynolds informed him that he had just been served. I'm afraid so, buddy, said a large man with a mask of sympathy on his face, snapping a digital photo of George holding a large brown envelope. George stood on the small porch of his house and stared at the statured process officer as he walked down the porch, wheezing and groaning. He looked at the front door of his house again, the keys still in his hand. But I, whispered George. And what, sir? There's a restraining order. You need to get someone from the police department to come get your stuff, advised Reynolds as he removed himself. Shit, Samantha, right? What is this? Yelled George through the door. Sir, you've been told about the restraining order, Reynolds said as he opened the door of his big 39-year-old Cadillac coupe. Don't make it any worse than it has to be, okay? George shook his head in bewilderment. As far as he knew, he and Samantha were happy. She had certainly rocked his world the night before he left for another 14-day shift offshore. He figured 14 days was enough time for someone to decide to end a marriage and file for divorce, but he couldn't remember what he had done or said that would make his wife file for annulment. George decided to call his wife's cousin, Polly Chastain. But after reviewing the divorce papers, George was convinced that Polly was the one who had prepared and filed them. Sir? Said the stone-faced policeman, tapping on the window of George's truck. Sir? You've been notified of a restraining order. Wow, that was fast, George bluffed. I just called and you're already here? I got a call that you were violating a restraining order, Brian Jochet said. Huh? So you're not here to help me get my stuff? Asked George. Brian called the station and said he had come to help George Luckett retrieve his personal belongings from the house. George waited patiently while the policeman reported to him the situation at the station. You really didn't call, did you? Brian smirked, walking over to him. No. But since you're here, said George. George had the good sense to remain silent as Samantha let him and the policeman into the house. With a chuckle, Samantha pointed to some trash bags and said that she had already packed all of George's things. George nodded and asked Brian, not Samantha, if he could double-check that she had indeed packed everything he was supposed to. Officer? I'm reaching into the nightstand to get my gun, George said as they stood in the master bedroom. You don't have? Samantha grinned, but immediately fell silent as George pulled out his Smith & Wesson .44 caliber. And my rosary beads. My mom gave them to me when I took my first communion, George said as he took the silver rosary beads from Samantha's nightstand drawer. You gave them to me when we got married, Samantha protested. And now you don't want to get married? I'm taking it back, George explained to her. George also took 3 pillows from the bed. He then retrieved a large quilt from the hall closet. My sister made it for me, George explained softly to Brian. She was a bloody retard, Samantha taunted George. And she called you sissy because she was so happy that she finally had a big sister, George reminded Samantha, removing the smirk from Samantha's face. After trying to check into the DeGard Hotel, George found that Samantha was busy. His cards had been canceled. A check of their joint checking account showed that there was $100 left in it. George smiled at the nervous clerk and pulled out his American Express credit card. The girl's hand trembled as she took it from his hands. George almost laughed when she exhaled. She didn't know about that card, George explained to the girl. I used it to buy her birthday and Christmas presents. Back in the room, George reread the papers again. Samantha demanded $4,000 a month in spousal support and full ownership of the house, with George continuing to pay the mortgage and all utilities. In return, she graciously allowed George to keep all the money in their savings and checking accounts. George was genuinely puzzled. There was no indication that Samantha was unhappy with him or their marriage. True, she called him a stick in the mud, but that's what she'd been calling him for years. When they bought the house, Samantha wanted to run right out and buy this and that for the house. Instead, George carefully planned every major purchase. He also doubled his monthly mortgage payments. It's called home equity, George explained to Samantha when she wanted to put money into a vacation account instead of a house account. But Hawaii, whined Samantha. We'll still be there for our 10-year anniversary, George assured her. It's only 3 years away, and we'll have 3 years more money for both the vacation and the house. Hawaii was stunning. The pictures of the paradise island just didn't convey reality. And Samantha, his pale-skinned red-headed beauty, looked beautiful in her turquoise blue monokini. George enjoyed applying sunscreen to her gorgeous body. George hoped Samantha had packed his 3 Hawaiian shirts when she cleared out his part of the closet. He doubted he would ever return to the paradise island, but he liked loose, comfortable shirts. Sighing, George searched his cell phone for a good lawyer. Richards, Pellichet, and Jones, a pleasant voice answered. When he heard the voice call out the name of the law firm, the enormity of his situation came over him. George sighed with a shudder. The pleasant voice repeated the name of the law firm again. I need an appointment with a divorce attorney, George managed to mumble out. Yes, sir, Ethel Gerard replied, her voice low and soothing. Ethel took some information and assured George that a lawyer would contact him within the hour. George thanked her and finished his Dr. Pepper. It occurred to George again that a vending machine selling beer would bring in a lot of money. Trevor Williams, Trevor announced when George answered the phone. I can meet you tomorrow morning. How about 9:30? Trevor pulled some strings, and the judge ordered the money returned to the bank accounts. Samantha was shocked when Polly called her and threatened to back out of the divorce if Samantha pulled any more stunts. Samantha wondered how George had managed to get a lawyer. She had purposely withdrawn all the money, leaving only enough for George to rent a motel room for a few nights. She canceled their credit cards before he even left for his 14-day shift offshore and reissued them in her name only. It doesn't matter how he managed to get a lawyer. He got one, snapped Polly. Cousin or no cousin, I'm not going to put up with that kind of crap. Do you understand? Grumbling, Samantha returned 50% of the funds to their checking and savings accounts. She also handed over 4 of the 8 CDs she'd taken from the safety deposit box. What about the house? The mortgage? Demanded Samantha. He'll keep paying half until the judge decides on the division of the property, said Polly. And the electricity? Demanded Samantha. He doesn't live there, you do. Pay the bills, sighed Polly. You know, despite what your friends have told you, in a no-fault divorce, you don't automatically get the gold mine and he gets the mine. And Samantha? Those accusations of abuse? You better be able to back them up. The courts really don't like being lied to or taken advantage of. You hear me? With the money in his new bank account, George rented a 1-bedroom apartment in a relatively nice neighborhood in Kimball, Louisiana. Casual was within walking distance, and Cowboy's BBQ was 3 minutes away by car. The young couple who rented the apartment next door were outgoing, boisterous, and friendly. He worked at Kendrick's Engineering, and she worked at Alana's Playtime in the delivery department. You work with Bowman? You know, we're the ones who handle your upgrades and maintenance, Foster Chalmers said proudly. Yes, sir? George smiled as he and Foster managed to drag George's nearly new sofa up the stairs to George's apartment. Denise Chalmers had somehow managed to talk George into leaving her a mailbox key and a spare key to the apartment. She checked his mail and dropped off mail at his apartment. Their mailboxes were next to each other in a kiosk. She took offense when George asked how much it would cost him. Foster offered a 6-pack of St. Elizabeth lager, but Denise slapped her husband on the buttocks. We're neighbors, yeah? Neighbors, they do things like this, Denise said in a thick Cajun accent. Maybe this neighbor will buy you a 6-pack of beer, just for fun? Asked George, seeing the disappointment on Foster's face. The next time George saw Samantha, she had a noticeable potbelly. She was also standing with an arrogant man in a very expensive suit. What's your approximate due date? Asked George to Samantha. We can petition, reminded Trevor to stone Samantha. About 4 months, Samantha admitted. While the 2 attorneys talked amongst themselves, George looked at his wife. She was a real beauty, waist-length red hair, porcelain skin with a scattering of freckles on her thin nose. And you can dance too, Samantha laughed happily as they twirled to the rousing music of the band Zydeco. Now, sitting in the St. Elizabeth Parish courtroom, George looked at his beautiful redhead again. It gave off that happy glow that pregnant women usually have, and George smiled sadly. Since Samantha couldn't produce any evidence, the restraining order was lifted. Trevor smirked when George whispered that he had not the slightest desire to be within 500 yards of her. Maybe, but it'll keep you out of jail, Trevor reminded George. So you can go grocery shopping and not worry that she might show up in the next aisle and start yelling that you're breaking the ban. The police? Not inclined to believe you weren't aware of her presence. What? Why? Why would you want to do that? Shrilled Samantha when George, through Trevor, demanded a paternity test. It's not yours. Insurance. You can't say you have the best insurance through your job, can you? Asked George. But I'm already on your insurance, Samantha objected. Oh no, ma'am, you're not, laughed George bitterly. Before you can get distracted, I've already been served. I'll put her and my baby on my insurance, William grinned. Well, you can probably say goodbye to spousal support, Polly hissed, turning to Samantha. What? Why? Demanded Samantha. You and the genius just admitted that you engaged in fornication while you were married to and living with Mr. Luckett, Polly sighed. In the future? Press your lips together and leave your boyfriend at home, okay? Before leaving for another 14-day shift, George took a blood test to Dr. Frank Roberts. He smiled, assuring George that it was safe to do the DNA test while the baby was in mommy. No harm would come to the baby. The sample was taken from the amniotic fluid, not the baby. Dr. Roberts told Trevor and Polly about George's concerns. Samantha's eyes filled with tears as Polly relayed this information to her. You know, maybe it's not too late, Polly said quietly to her cousin. Samantha only shook her head. She left her cousin's office and drove to Mountain Park. Seated on a swing, Samantha slowly rocked back and forth until the heat of the sun forced her back into the air-conditioned car. Bowman Engineering was insured through Young Insurance. Tricarter, William's place of employment, was insured through Mutual Fidelity Insurance Group. Dr. Roger Peeler accepted Young Insurance's medical plans, but did not accept Mutual Fidelity. Dr. Ellen Sweetman accepted Mutual Fidelity's insurance plan, but Samantha had been going to Dr. Peeler since she married George and got on his insurance plan. And during her one visit with Dr. Ellen Sweetman, Samantha didn't like the assembly line approach the kind doctor and her staff seemed to take. She gave me that fine ass, William stated rudely. Oh God, shut up, shouted Polly to the man. Jesus, William, really? Shrieked Samantha, thoroughly embarrassed. George smelled the odor of alcohol. He was pretty sure the odor was not coming from himself, his lawyer, or Samantha and her lawyer. Really? Well, she always said I was too big, George said calmly. But congratulations, I'm sure it's fantastic. Shut up, Trevor hissed, trying to hide his amusement. George smirked as he watched William blush hotly, while the two paralegals and the reporter couldn't hide their snarkiness. William looked at Polly with white-hot hatred as she ordered him to leave the conference room. After the papers were signed and notarized, Trevor and George went to the restroom. George was sure he had picked up a bug during his shift at the beach. His bowels were loose. Trevor spoke through the closed stall door and wished his client well before leaving. Yeah, I've got 3 days to get it all out of my system, George muttered. Exiting the restroom, George almost bumped into Samantha, who was coming out of the women's restroom. George apologized and let Samantha walk him to the glass doors of the office building. Getting into his pickup truck, George saw Samantha looking around. His first impulse was to shrug and drive away. She'd filed for divorce. She'd evicted him from his own home. But a second instinct took over, and he rolled down the window of his pickup. Problem? He asked. Me, William. We parked right here, Samantha stammered, pointing to an empty parking space. Where are you going? Asked George, pulling his cell phone out of the console of the truck. Home, I guess, Samantha admitted. Okay. Oh, how about it? Uber is on its way here, George said, looking at his cell phone screen. You don't have to do that, Samantha stammered, embarrassed. Samantha, Were you a complete stranger? I wouldn't have been able to just drive off and leave you here. But you're not a stranger. You're the mother of my child, George said softly. Hey, how about this? Making a lunch reservation, and I get a notice that you need a ride, said a smiling young man, pulling up in a fairly new BMW. Are you George? I'm George. That's exactly what I told her. You're on your way, George said. Thank you. Have a good day. Samantha's eyes filled with tears again as she watched George's truck pull out of the parking lot. She sat in the back seat of the Uber driver's car and waited while paralegal Polly accepted a few packages from Cowboy's BBQ. Dude, now I'm really hungry smelling the food, laughed the young man. And I'm taking you to... Oh, hey, there are some nice houses in that neighborhood. Yes, there are, Samantha agreed quietly. Denise sent Foster to George's apartment with a large bowl of her chicken noodle soup. George and Foster smirked at Denise's insistence that chicken noodle soup would cure whatever George had, but George still ate the delicious soup. After washing and drying the bowl, George filled it to the brim with Reese's Pieces. Denise blabbed that it was her favorite treat. Foster and George laughed at Denise's squeal. Although she protested that he shouldn't have done it, that she didn't need the calories, and George knew how fatty these candies were, Denise happily ate a handful of candy. While overseas, George used autopay through his bank to pay all his bills. He didn't know why, but he smiled when he saw among the bills a bill from Dr. Roger Peeler. Hey, we're going to Vermilion, and you are, Denise ordered as George entered the house. Okay, George smiled, knowing that arguing with his stubborn neighbor was not going to lead to anything good. Shirley Fournay is playing. Do you like her? Continued Denise. She has a friend from work she wants you to meet, warned George Foster, as Denise returned to the bedroom to finish getting ready. She's not from work. I just saw her at work, Denise corrected. Tammy Hale was a real estate agent with fiery red hair and a flamboyant personality. George had liked her from the start, and the feeling seemed to be mutual. They danced almost every dance, and when they stopped for a beer, they chatted and laughed. But even though the evening was enjoyable, both Tammy and George realized that there was no spark, no real chemistry between them. They parted, kissing each other on the cheek and sincerely thanking each other for a fun time. Denise isn't going to leave, Foster said, and George smiled and shrugged. Look, I work all the time, George said, so it's hard for me to meet women on my own. See? Exclaimed Denise triumphantly. So you just keep quiet. But Denise, no more redheads, okay? Said George, showing Denise a picture of Samantha on his cell phone. Oh, so why didn't you say anything? Sighed Denise, seeing that Samantha and Tammy could be sisters. Because you never asked, Foster stated triumphantly. You were going to get some, Denise stated. But now. Come on, woman. I asked you to dance, Foster whined as they closed their apartment door. The thick envelope lay on the kitchen table with the other mail when George returned from a nerve-wracking shift. A tropical depression threatened to turn into a hurricane, and George, as shift supervisor, kept a constant eye on the weather. He slept very little and worried every day whether he would have to evacuate the rig. He was grateful that he had transferred to the ship and left all the worries and stresses to Greg Bookhammer, the other shift supervisor. Sure, George laughed when the Weather Channel app on his phone showed the depression ebbing and flowing that morning. The legal certificate ending the marriage did little to lift his spirits, however. George sullenly read the legal article and for a moment wondered how Samantha had felt when she received a copy of the decree. George poured himself a few fingers of chocolate-flavored Iron Barrel whiskey into a small glass and grimly drank to his failure as a husband. George was away when William, grumbling and complaining, drove Samantha to St. Elizabeth's Trauma Center. 11 hours later, with only Dr. Peeler and a nurse helping in the delivery room for the last 2 hours while William excused himself to the cafeteria, Samantha gave birth to Cynthia Barbara Luckett. William was outraged that the child bore that son of a bitch's last name rather than his own. We're not married. Why should I call her Carter? Samantha said tiredly. But isn't she beautiful? Uh-huh, William agreed, not even looking at the crumpled and bruised mess in Samantha's hands. Cynthia had all her fingers and toes, brown eyes, and fiery red hair. At 6 pounds 4 ounces and 19 inches long, she was just the right size and weight for a fully developed infant. George nodded contentedly upon receiving the news of his daughter's birth. His mother's name was Barbara, and he wondered if good old William knew that little bit of information. Samantha's mother's name was Cynthia, but that was also the name of George's beautiful, sweet, loving sister. George wondered if Samantha remembered that fact when she named her baby girl Cynthia. George wondered if Samantha remembered Cindy's happiness at finally having a big sister. George wondered if Samantha remembered taking Cindy to the zoo in Lafayette, taking Cindy to Bolorama. George wondered if Samantha remembered holding Cindy's hand when Cindy's congenital heart defect took their special little sister away from them. Once on dry land, George immediately bought Raggy Andy and Raggy Ann dolls for his daughter. Apparently, Samantha had a new phone number. He received a message that the number had been changed or was no longer in service. George didn't want to show up unannounced and called Polly Chastain's office. Polly promised to call Samantha. Samantha called George less than 3 minutes later. She agreed that now would be a good time to come in and see the baby. George flinched when he saw William's Mercedes-Benz in the open garage. The message was loud and clear. William left the door up so George could see him and realize that he had been replaced by a better, richer, and more handsome man. William smirked from behind Samantha's back as she opened the front door to let George into the house. Samantha smiled happily as George handed the sleeping girl 2 dolls. He placed the dolls on the footboard of the crib, then squatted down and just gazed in wonder at the beautiful baby. He paid no attention to William's posturing and preening and focused his attention on his daughter. "Oh, I almost forgot," George said, and held out a small package to Samantha. "This is for you." "What is it?" demanded William. "When she opens it, you'll see," said George, and squatted down again to look at the beautiful baby girl. "Oh, George, it's... Samantha choked at the sight of a 5x7 silver photo frame with Cynthia's name and date of birth engraved on the bottom. "You put her baby picture in there," George said, and snapped a picture of Cynthia with his cell phone. "Hi, honey. It's me. Hi. It's Daddy." Excuse me? She's going to call me Daddy," William stated. "Maybe," George agreed easily, though his blood was boiling. "I'm sure she'll have names for both of us." William interjected into the conversation again when George politely asked for Samantha's new phone number. When she called him, only private popped up on the screen. George's statement that he only needed the phone number because of their shared daughter didn't appease William, who snarled that George didn't need Samantha's phone number. "Oh, okay," George said. "I can always call Polly, I guess." Bet! George was 3 blocks from the house when his phone buzzed. He looked up and smiled. Samantha had sent him her phone number with the subject line, Cynthia. The day before he went ashore again, Cynthia was awake. And even better, William wasn't around. Sitting in his new rocking chair and holding his precious baby girl in his arms, George sobbed happily. "I'm sorry, but you need to leave," Samantha said softly but firmly. He nodded meekly and walked out of the house. However, he laughed when he saw William's Mercedes-Benz around the corner. He smiled broadly and waved at William as their cars passed each other. The tinted windows obscured George's view, but George was sure that William didn't respond to his friendly greeting. Trevor had to intervene when Samantha objected to George inviting his daughter into his apartment. Samantha panicked when she realized that Cynthia would not be in her home, Cynthia's crib, for the foreseeable future. She insisted on coming over and checking out the apartment, making sure her baby would be in a safe environment. "Hi! Hi! I'm your Aunt Denise! Hi!" stammered Denise Chalmers as George carried the infant from his truck to the front door. "George? Who's that?" asked Samantha, concerned about the short, stocky woman raving about her daughter. "Hey, Willie, do you believe the Saints picked Jameis Winston? I mean, yeah, I know Breeze retired, but what about Taysom Hill, huh?" demanded Foster, as William shadowed Samantha, looking around at everyone and everything. "Me, what? Dude, this is William, okay? Not Willie," William corrected himself. Reluctantly, Samantha approved of the cast-iron crib that matched the cast-iron double bed. She was not surprised to see that the bed was neatly made. It didn't surprise her that George had a small trash can that he would put in the sparkling clean tub when it was time to bathe his daughter. It didn't surprise her that there was baby soap, baby shampoo, and baby lotion. And I told him to get some A&D ointment because it's the best for diaper rash, Denise showed Samantha the tube of ointment in George's medicine cabinet. Do you use cloth diapers or disposable? Disposable, Samantha replied, still unsure of this Aunt Denise thing. Was all Denise said on the subject. Samantha discovered that William and Foster had bonded not over their shared love of the New Orleans Saints, but over George's chocolate-flavored Iron Barrel whiskey. Samantha stoically held out her hand for William's car keys. What Jesus? I only had two or three, William declared fervently. Foster, Denise said, letting her husband know she wasn't too happy about him stealing booze from their neighbor. Man, we gotta figure out what this is. An iron barrel? Oh, hey, chocolate? Denise, you know whiskey comes in different flavors, said Foster cheerfully and drunkenly as Denise led him out of the apartment. Keys, or I can take an Uber, Samantha demanded as William staggered up from George's comfortable couch. Samantha pulled William toward the car. Samantha made sure to schedule Cynthia Barbara Luckett's christening for Sunday, when George would be home. At the christening, Richard Chastain, Samantha's father, let George know that he was very disappointed in his daughter's act. Richard and George had always had an awkward, strained relationship. Richard was sure his daughter could do better than marry a cad. Even after George was promoted to shift supervisor, her father was sure she could do better. But now, even though William Carter held a third of Tri-Carter's oilfield services company, Richard wasn't sure his girl had changed for the better. And, seeing George flinch when Cynthia cried, when water was poured over her head, and William just bored, Richard was sure his daughter hadn't traded away. It's not my doing, George defended himself, as they ate a meal at Samantha's house after the christening. Yes, I know it is. At least she was honest about it, Richard grudgingly agreed. That woman keeps calling herself Aunt Denise. Is that your girlfriend? No, she's married to that goon over there in the Saints t-shirt, George laughed, pointing to where Foster was standing, eating hot meatballs and whistling because they were too hot. The party was soon over. Foster and Denise left. The Saints were battling the Carolina Panthers, and Foster didn't want to miss the second half of the game. Some of Samantha's co-workers at Casa Ol Mexican restaurant left as soon as it became clear that the alcohol wasn't going to come out. She's going to call me Daddy, William teased George as George sat up and rocked the baby. Oh, I'm sure she'll have a name for you, George said as he met William's gaze. William, Samantha said, pressing her lips together. And if it isn't? I have a few suggestions, George said, and smirked when Richard laughed. George, Samantha said, pressing her lips together even tighter. Bye, honey, bye, George whispered softly to the sleeping infant. Daddy misses you already. Thank you, Samantha said quietly, as George put his hand on the doorknob to his daughter's room. The cross and chain are very pretty. I'm sure once she's old enough, she'll wear it with pride. I'm sure she will, George smiled. Monday afternoon, George was walking from the laundry room of their home when he saw a little girl standing in front of Denise's door. The girl had thick brown hair that almost touched the sidewalk in front of the door, though she had pulled it into a high ponytail. When she turned to see who was coming up behind her, George was struck by her clear green eyes. They usually get home around 5:30 to 6 o'clock, George offered. Oh, okay, the girl said, already fully turned around. George saw that it wasn't a girl, but a very short woman. Hi, I'm George, George said, unlocking his apartment door. George Luckett. Oh, you're George? The same one who has such a beautiful baby? Chirped the girl, and her pretty face broke into a broad smile. Yes, ma'am, I am. And let me tell you, there is nothing more beautiful than my Cynthia, George agreed proudly, placing the laundry basket in front of his door. Man, George pulled out his phone and showed the girl the most recent pictures taken at Cynthia's christening. Oh, the girl sighed. Hi. I see you've met Cha-Cha, said Foster. Charlene Charmer's face instantly turned from an adoring smile to a disgruntled grimace. She shifted her gaze from Foster's laughing face to George's slightly curious face. And I see you've met my second favorite brother, Charlene snapped at him. And how many brothers do you have? Asked George, certain that Foster's immediate circle only included sisters. One, Charlene snapped back. George took the laundry into his apartment and then crossed the threshold of the Charmers' apartment. Foster was making coffee. George couldn't understand how Foster and Denise could consume so much caffeine and still sleep. Foster said you're working offshore? Asked Charlene. Yes, I'm out tomorrow for repairs, said George. Why I was doing laundry? I'm an administrative assistant, said Charlene proudly. She works right down the street here, said Foster, his pride obvious. Where do you work? Asked George, thinking the girl looked very young for an administrative assistant. I work for Vickers, and Dumas. They do investigations, said Charlene. Maybe they need to find out where the others are? Suggested Foster. Suggested Foster. Suggested Foster. Hey, George, maybe you noticed? She's no more than 3 feet up there. George, do you have coffee in the next room? I'm not going to sit here until Denise gets home, Charlene said, jumping up from her chair in the kitchen. I can whip us up something quick, George said. Hey, Foster, see if they'll investigate why you're such an ass, huh? Yeah, agreed Charlene, ushering George out of the apartment. Coffee's almost ready, Foster protested. When Denise comes in, tell her your sister's in the next room, George said. At his apartment, George learned that Foster's sister's name was Charlene. Charlene Paula Charmers. Because her name was Charlene Charmers, the family had given her the hated nickname Cha-Cha. Charlene was 19 years old and enrolled at St. Anne's Military Technical Institute as an administrative assistant. The Nicole King Scholarship had paid for her tuition, and now she planned to contribute 5% of her paycheck to the Nicole King Scholarship until she paid them back. My cousin Michelle went to UCLA for 4 years, got a degree in literature, and now she works at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, Charlene said, and sipped her coffee. I like your mug. Where is View Island located? Is it in the bay? Say it a little slower, George suggested, pouring himself a mug of decaf. View Island, Charlene pronounced it. Well, even though we just met? I love you too, George smiled. The island? Oh, said Charlene, and then laughed a happy musical laugh. My goofball husband says you're here, said Denise, bursting into the apartment. George, did you show her some pictures of that beautiful baby? Of course, Charlene replied, jumping down and hugging her 4-foot 11-inch tall sister-in-law. Did Foster tell you I work right there? Right at Vickers and Dumas? Lopez Square? Right there? Clarified Denise, pointing to the squat, ugly building. Uh-huh, Charlene said proudly. George found himself being dragged back to the Charmer apartment while Denise prepared dinner. George decided that he would buy Charlene her own 16-ounce mug labeled Island View. Figuring out that her favorite color was pink was fairly easy. Foster, Charlene, and Denise answered the question in unison. Somehow, between the meal and George finally dragging himself out of the apartment, he promised himself to take Charlene to Vermilion for a night of dancing the next time he came in from his shift. Aunt Denise immediately volunteered to be a babysitter for Cynthia Luckett. Hey, look, my sister, my little sister. She's only 19, you hear me? Foster glared menacingly at George. And? How old were we? Yelled Denise at her husband. My God, me, could you be any more douchey? Charlene pounced on her brother, blushing hotly. We're going to dance. We're going to dance. That's it, okay? Back from his 14-day shift, George insisted on picking up Charlene from her parents' house. He insisted on going into the house to meet Hank and Debbie Charmers. Charlene watched in amazement as George and her overprotective father told tall tales about deer seasons in the not-too-distant past. They promised that they would try to get together to hunt this season, Sure, this one? You, Daddy, I don't want to eat deer, Hank said, embarrassed, affectionately slapping his daughter's compact buttocks. Hank, Debbie smiled, shaking her head. Daddy, Charlene whimpered. The band Zydeco was a good band with an annoying singer. The blind guitarist sang all the songs through his nose, giving everything a nasal sound that didn't really suit the music or his voice. But the band itself gave off upbeat music that you could stomp along to. When are you picking up Cynthia? Asked Charlene as George walked her to the front door. Dad, what have you been talking about while parked in the truck for the last 10 minutes? Asked Hank, swinging the door open as Charlene stepped out onto the porch. Charlene let out a squeal. George noticed the amused gleam in Hank's eyes when Charlene squealed. George smirked. And we were wondering how long it would take you to come here and kick my ass, George agreed easily. Good night, Charlene. Good night, Hank. Huh? This is Mr. Hank, young man, Hank said, pulling Charlene into the house. Yes, sir, Mr. Hank, George smiled. I plan to take her out to dinner tomorrow night at Sweet Peas. Is that okay with you? What do they have? Asked Hank, grinning as he heard his daughter complain bitterly to her mother. Do you care? You know it's going to be good. George smiled and got into his truck. The stuffed pork chops were excellent. Charlene surprised George by managing to finish her plate, but neither of them had room for dessert. By this time, Samantha had not only gotten used to Denise's bossy personality, but felt comfortable around her. In a way, Samantha had decided that she and Denise were friends. That's why she responded to requests to show new photos of the baby with smiles. George was not surprised to see two women and a baby on his doorstep when Samantha and Cynthia arrived at his apartment. William opted to stay in the car. Other than drinking, William and Foster had nothing in common, and Samantha had laid down the law. William must not drink in George's apartment. He nodded his head politely when George's strange neighbor waved him over in greeting. I'm okay. I'm well, you get it? Yeah, I know you can handle it, Samantha murmured, giving Cynthia another kiss. If you need anything, just give me a call, okay? Bye, sweetheart. Bye, Cynthia. Mommy misses you already. Bye. Not 5 minutes later, William and Samantha pulled out of the parking lot, and Charlene was already knocking on George's door. Hi, is she here? The baby's here, Charlene demanded, barging into the apartment. George set the decaf coffee brewing while Charlene squealed and fussed over the infant. Then he set his green Isle of View mug and her new pink Isle of View mug on the table. Can I hold her? Asked Charlene, already holding Cynthia in her arms as she carried the infant into the living dining room. What good would my refusal do? Smiled George. No, said Charlene as she sat down on the comfortable couch. Hi, Cindy. Hi, sweetie. Hi. George felt tears welling up as Charlene quietly sang a few Cajun songs to the infant. His mother used to sing those songs to him, and he remembered her singing them to his sister Cindy. Even when his sister turned 15, Cindy demanded that her mother sing these songs to her. Cindy would have loved you, George thought, as he looked at the beautiful 19-year-old girl holding an infant in her arms. Oh, psychic, Charlene said as she sipped from her mug of coffee. I love you too. I'm going to heat up some stew. Are you staying? Asked George. Huh? No. My mom makes stuffed peppers on the stove. She got the recipe from the show The Cast Iron Skillet. Have you ever watched it? Asked Charlene. Milt Duhan? Yes. I loved the way he cooked with alligator and rat from the children's show, agreed George. Oh, I know. I laughed when he was about to hit alligator with the skillet, Charlene giggled. After kissing, Charlene left his apartment. George ate dinner, then bathed his baby girl and fed her milk from a bottle. He tried to remember the words to the lullabies, but most of the songs had to be hummed while he held the baby in his arms. The management company dropped a notice in the mailbox. George had a month left on his lease. If he signed on for another year, they'd take $100 off the first month's rent. If he signed for 6 months, they'd charge $50 on the first month's rent. But if he decided to rent the apartment by the month, the rent would go up $25 a month. At least you did one good deed, Denise, George thought as he called Tammy Hale. So, what are you looking for? Asked Tammy pleasantly. Denise said you had a baby. Congratulations. While he and Tammy chatted, George checked the Davis Realty website and saw a one-story house 3 blocks from his former residence. He gave Tammy the address and MLS number. Oh, that's the one? Oh, yes, sir, it's priced to sell, Tammy agreed. I can pick you up and… Tammy, if you don't have a car seat in your car, I'll meet you there, George insisted. Denise insisted on coming, and Foster, grumbling, tore himself away from the ESPN sports screen. Look, he's got a nice fenced yard. You can put a swing set here, Denise declared. The basketball goal is already standing, Foster said, as he saw the old backboard and hoop set up over the garage. It needs a net for it. Yeah, he'll remove that ugly thing, Denise insisted. Really? George smiled. Yeah. What? You think Cynthia's going to be a basketball player? Said Denise. So here? That's where you need to put her baby bed, in this room right here. Ned, Charlene went out the next evening and approved the house. It was a 15-minute walk from her parents' house. It was quicker if she rode a bicycle, and even quicker if she drove a car. And there's a gas stove in here? Enthused Charlene. Tammy, let's start the paperwork, said George. The application was approved. The First National Bank of DeHardy gave George a home loan, and Foster supervised the loading of George's furniture as short moves pulled up to the apartment complex. Denise supervised the unloading of George's furniture and boxes at the new house. The 3 muscular men were professionals. They knew enough to politely agree with everything the short woman said. Thank you, ma'am, the foreman said, as Denise handed each a crumpled 20 and an even more crumpled 5. Men. Better believe the man she married? I mean, they're putting their feet up, one of the men said, as they scurried to get to the next planned step. My mommy could have spanked your ass with a wooden spoon and then 5 minutes later used the same spoon to make dinner, the foreman agreed. Those coon-ass women? Don't mess with them. Samantha arrived, bringing Cynthia and William to George's new home. George was nice to both Samantha and William. Truth be told, he didn't want this arrogant, smirking man in his home. But George was mature enough to realize that rudeness and inhospitality would accomplish nothing. Wow, you could walk here, Samantha commented. Yeah, you'll probably see us outside walking, George said, showing Samantha the new stroller he had bought. Yep. No pool? Grinned William, peering into the backyard through the atrium doors. William, Samantha said surreptitiously. What, damn it? I can't say a word without you getting mad, objected William. Hey, whose Benz is this? Asked Charlene, entering the house. Mine, William smiled. George, is that? Demanded Samantha. Samantha, this is Charlene Chalmers, said George. She's my girlfriend. George didn't know why he had a hard time admitting that this beautiful girl was his girlfriend. George assumed that part of his hesitation was because he was having a hard time accepting the fact that Samantha was his ex-wife and not his wife. Charlene, that's Samantha, George said. She's Cynthia's mom. Uh-huh, Charlene said, standing up next to George. Very nice to meet you. Charlene took George's hand, letting him know that he would have to explain or try to explain the slight hitch in his voice as he introduced her as his girlfriend. Samantha agreed. In Cynthia's nursery, George had placed a changing table as well as a new low dresser. Samantha was not surprised to see that the changing table matched Cynthia's crib. Nor was she surprised that it had an adorable lamp on it, a little ballerina stretching upward and holding the lampshade aloft. It was part of what so annoyed Samantha about her husband, her ex-husband. Everything was neat and orderly and in its place. Their finances were the same, neat, orderly, and organized. They had money, and they could have gone to Hawaii. But George insisted they wait. And we had a lot more money to do a lot more things, Samantha murmured as she saw the toy box in the closet, several brand new toys waiting for Cynthia to start playing with them. Let's go, Samantha suddenly demanded, grabbing William's hand. Samantha almost smiled. She could read the look on Charlene's face. William, as narcissistic as he was, caught Samantha's intent as she grabbed his arm. George got it. Charlene tearfully asked him if he was ashamed of her, if he was embarrassed of her, or maybe he hadn't gotten over his ex-wife yet. George hugged and kissed Charlene, lifting her easily. Softly and calmly, he explained to her the difficulties he had faced when his ex-wife and his love were in the same room at the same time. "Am I your love?" asked Charlene, melting in his arms. While George and Charlene were making up, cuddling on his couch, William was in Samantha's living room. "I'm leaving," Samantha said as she hurried across the living room to the garage. "I don't know when I'll be back. You'll have dinner on your own, got it?" "Oh, okay," William said, rising to his feet. "Love you." William didn't notice that Samantha didn't respond to the endearment. He walked over to the bar in the corner and poured himself a few fingers of George's St. Elizabeth Premium whiskey. After checking the weight of the bottle, William poured a few more fingers into the glass. "Need to see you," Samantha texted her cousin Polly as William traveled the 3 blocks from George's new home to their house. Polly's reply didn't make Samantha very happy. Polly and her wife were at the Casual, a small establishment that both women had decided to make their home. Samantha would have preferred complete privacy in Polly's office, or better yet, in her beautiful and cozy home. Just without Whitney. Samantha didn't dislike the beautiful blonde. It was damn hard not to like the simpering, sweet, affectionate Whitney. Without Whitney's presence, Samantha could ignore Polly's lifestyle, pretend it didn't exist. "Hey, Terry, one more diet for me and they'll have a shot of that oak leaf, okay?" exclaimed Polly cheerfully as Samantha entered the cozy, quiet bar. "Yay!" Whitney giggled happily, leaning against Polly. "Joe Bob, Carla's on her way, you hear?" Terry, an older man, turned to a heavily intoxicated customer. "Oh shit, that's great. She sees me like this," muttered Joe Bob, resting his head on the bar. "Drink slowly," Whitney admonished, as Terry placed a shot glass of the amber liquid in front of Samantha. "Oh, son of a bitch. This is good," enthused Samantha, sipping the smooth whiskey. "So what's up?" asked Polly, ushering Samantha and Whitney into a corner booth. Samantha started, stopped, took another sip of whiskey and shook her head. Polly gently placed her hand on Whitney's thigh, seeing that Whitney was about to come to Samantha's rescue. The appearance of a beautiful but haggard blonde interrupted their conversation. They couldn't hear what the woman was saying to the drunken man, but they could hear the desperation in her voice. Yeah, hell yeah, let's go," Joe Bob growled, stumbling back on his stool. Taking another breath, Samantha looked up at the dark paneled wall and spoke. She quietly told the 2 women that she felt suffocated, trapped in her marriage to George Luckett. She wanted to live, wanted to have fun. But George couldn't or wouldn't be spontaneous. Fun. "He even makes his bed before he leaves the room," Samantha grumbled. "Swears he can't leave the bedroom until—" Whitney giggled, and Polly playfully slapped Whitney. Samantha paid no attention to the lovers' tiff between the 2 women, continuing to complain about George's careful thought, planning, and preparation. Then she recounted her encounter with William when he came to the Margarita on Friday. Being an attractive red-haired girl, Samantha was used to being approached by male and sometimes female customers. Most of them stopped when Samantha showed them her very beautiful engagement ring and matching wedding band. "George saved every penny he could," Samantha said quietly as she looked at her bare finger. "He even took to painting houses on the weeks he was on vacation." "Oh." Whitney couldn't contain the delighted sigh that escaped her lips. "Yes," Samantha agreed quietly, and tried to take another sip of the excellent whiskey from her empty glass. That Friday morning, Samantha mentioned to George that she had seen a brand new Lexus on the road the other day. She didn't say she wanted one, she just said she'd seen it, and it was very nice. George immediately vetoed the idea of buying her a new car of any make and model. "Depreciation starts the minute the wheels touch the ground," Samantha mimicked George's deep voice. Samantha went to work that day with a sour mood. When the handsome and chatty William Carter boarded her compartment, Samantha noticed the expensive suit, large diamond ring, and Rolex watch. Leaving a signed check with a 100% tip, William also left his business card. Wouldn't be the first time someone left their business card, Samantha muttered. But this was the first time Samantha hadn't just thrown away a business card. The Tri-Carter logo was in the upper right corner, and William Carter, president of sales, was located right in the center of the business card. On the back, William wrote his cell phone number. At first, the illicit affair was exciting, thrilling, spontaneous, and fun. Then George came along. For a whole week, I had to be a good, obedient wife, do good, obedient things, nibble away every penny until Lincoln let out a squeal, Samantha pondered. And now? Asked Polly after a long pause. And now? Pondered Samantha, looking at the tabletop. Really, they didn't spare a penny. If Samantha wanted cinnamon rolls, she could buy the Pillsbury brand, not Burns & Burns grocers. For beef stroganoff, she could get a round eye rather than the stew George always insisted on. She and William went to the movies at regular movie times when most people went, not dollar discount matinees. William went to the kiosk and bought a huge buttered popcorn. Afterward, they would head to the Yum Yum ice cream parlor to each have an ice cream cone. George would always hand them one or the other. They could get a big buttered popcorn and a drink, or they could go to the ice cream parlor afterward. Okay, so George is a cheapskate, Polly said. No, he isn't. He's not a cheapskate. Samantha rose to George's defense. He's just incredibly practical. William wasn't practical. William had never thought about saving money for a rainy day. All his life he'd had a golden umbrella. Everything in her house, the house she and William shared, every piece of furniture, every glass, every plate had been bought by George. Samantha tried, but could not name a single item in the house that had been bought by William. Soap, Samantha said aloud. I buy A&A soap. I like the raw milk and honey soap, Whitney enthused. It stinks, Polly teased. I take the blackberry one, Samantha offered absent-mindedly. Another one? Suggested Polly quietly as Samantha raised her empty glass again. Yes, Whitney, you can have another one too, Polly laughed, and Whitney rushed to the bar. You don't drink? Remarked Samantha, as Whitney placed 2 shot glasses on the table. Not good for the baby, Polly smiled, and Whitney let out another happy squeal. Samantha was shocked when Whitney's hand ended up on Polly's flat tummy. Polly put her hand on Whitney's hand, pressing it against their baby. Samantha took a sip of whiskey and tried to smile at her cousin and her cousin's wife. Obviously, they were both excited about the pregnancy. William was content strutting around the house like a proud rooster in the hen house. Until George's damned DNA test came back, showing that George, not William, was the father of the baby. I hope it's a girl. She and Cynthia can play together, Samantha said, as Whitney giggled and Polly glared. So, Samantha, what are you thinking about? Asked Polly after a few moments of silence. Samantha was thinking about the awkward and uncomfortable Sunday lunch at Minnie Carter's house the previous Sunday. The lunch itself had been very good. Minnie's maid, a very proper Englishwoman, had cooked. Minnie was polite but cold to Samantha and didn't even look at Cynthia. Natalie, William's sister, had an unruly 2-year-old daughter, Elizabeth Carter. Natalie was somewhat friendly with Samantha. Andrew, William's younger brother, brought his wife, 5-year-old daughter Rihanna, and AJ's 1-year-old son, Andrew Jr., to dinner. Andrew was a redhead with hard, cold eyes. His wife Victoria was a bizarre sight with facial piercings and tattoos. Andrew called her Rhea, and Samantha had done the ridiculous thing of calling the ugly blonde Rhea. Samantha? Honey? We're not lovers, Victoria said stiffly. So don't call me Rhea, okay? I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Samantha stammered. That was the end of the conversation. The old servant responded to Samantha's compliment on his cooking with a stony nod. Samantha thanked Minnie for inviting her to dinner at her beautiful home, and Minnie simply nodded with a fake smile on her face. From the first minute she was in Miss Barbara's house, George's mother pulled Samantha into the kitchen. Naturally, Cindy wanted to follow her, and all three women worked together to prepare Sunday dinner while George and his father sat watching a boring soccer game on TV. "Come here," Cindy ordered as George peeked into the kitchen. "It's just us girls here. No boys." "Yes," Samantha giggled, earning a beaming smile from Cindy. Samantha remembered it was like this every Sunday. The warmth of the Luckett's kitchen, the smells, the laughter, Cindy wanting constant affirmation from Miss Barbara, and Samantha. Samantha had no doubt that the next Sunday lunch at Miss Carter's house would be just as strained, just as uncomfortable. And the next one would be the same, just as awkward and uncomfortable. And William didn't notice it. He was genuinely surprised when Samantha mentioned her discomfort. "I think I have a bad case of buyer's remorse," Samantha admitted to her cousin, tearing her gaze away from the dark wood of the table. "And," clarified Polly. "And nothing, absolutely bloody nothing," said Samantha, taking the last sip of her drink. Back at her apartment, Samantha heated up some food from Lean Cuisine. Later, she had a little fun with William. William approached George and asked if there was any way he could watch Cynthia for 2 weeks while he took Samantha on a cruise. George made arrangements with Bowman, but not for William or Samantha, but for his daughter. Samantha was almost frantic when they boarded the ship. Before, when George had their daughter, she was only a short walk away. But here on the cruise ship, she was several hundred miles away. If the baby needed her, Samantha would have no way to get to Cynthia. "Damn it, man, do you hear that? Hear that?" enthused William, stretching out on the bed in their cabin. "Huh?" asked Samantha, looking around. "Right. No screaming and crying children," William chuckled. At that moment, Samantha hated William Carter with all her heart. Her child, her precious little girl, was not a brat. Her daughter was not a nuisance, not an inconvenience. And so, across the glacier, William got down on one knee, holding out a 4-carat square-cut diamond ring. To Samantha's eyes, it was one of the ugliest rings she'd ever seen. It was simply gaudy. Although Samantha was sure they were asking a considerable price for it, it looked cheap and tasteless. "No," Samantha replied quietly but firmly. What? What, you? You must be joking," whispered William, genuinely shocked. "No need to make a bad situation worse," sighed Samantha, turning to join the tour group. The return trip passed in stony silence. For Samantha, the return trip was more pleasant. William didn't pester her with questions, and she was much closer to her baby girl. As soon as the door of the house opened, William began to gather his things. Samantha grabbed her car keys and went to rescue her baby girl and bring her home. "Hey, she's almost down," whispered a tired George as he let Samantha into his house. Samantha stood listening to Charlene quietly singing along to Cynthia. Samantha remembered Miss Barbara singing those songs to Cindy. Samantha's eyes filled with tears when she heard the familiar lullaby. "Yes, Mommy, it sounds like we've had colic this week," George admitted as Charlene carried the sleeping baby out of the room. "Colic!" "Oh no," exclaimed Samantha, feeling terribly guilty that her baby wasn't feeling well and she hadn't come to the rescue. "Hi, Samantha," Charlene smiled tiredly as she entered the kitchen. "What's up? How did it go? I've never been to Alaska, you know." I hated it," Samantha admitted. "I'm drinking your last beer," Charlene informed George. "Really? Even though I've already put another 6-pack in there?" asked George. "I see you're still only drinking 1 6-pack at a time," Samantha smiled softly. "Yep." "Hey, there's a lot more room in the pantry," George defended himself. "Samantha, do you need anything?" offered Charlene, unscrewing the cap off the barley turling. "How cold is this beer?" asked Samantha. "Should be cold by now," said George. "Okay, I'll come back tomorrow. When are you going ashore?" asked Samantha, looking over to Cynthia. "Tuesday," said George. "Then it won't be 4 weeks before I'm back. I've exchanged with Greg for that extra week." "And that's so like you," Samantha thought, almost angry at George's practicality. "No, can't use a single day of vacation. No, have to try to think through all the angles to make it better, damn it. Just, damn it." Upon Samantha's return, the house looked like a tornado had swept through it. William hadn't broken anything, but he hadn't bothered to put everything back in its place. Dresser drawers hung half open, hangers of clothes lying on the floor and on the bed. Sighing, Samantha put everything back in place and then vacuumed the entire house. She smirked. She was doing exactly what George would have done. Cynthia's child support payment always came 3 days before the due date. Because of her infidelity, Samantha was not receiving spousal support. Also, Samantha didn't need spousal support. She had William and William's credit card to rely on. 2 months after William left, Samantha realized she was in trouble. Her meager savings had run out. She was faced with a choice: pay the mortgage or pay the utilities and buy food. But she didn't have the means to do both. The Happy Land Day Care Center, where she brought her daughter when she went to work on the 2 weeks George wasn't home, took most of her child support. "Daddy, I need help," Samantha said. "You need help? Do you need help? The damn insulin tripled in just 1 month, and the damn insurance company is trying to say that the tree that fell on the house wasn't caused by a damn hurricane. It wasn't a hurricane, then what? It's not like I pushed it on the house," her father muttered into his cell phone. "You need some help? Join the club." George smiled happily as Samantha led their daughter into the house. A few minutes later, Denise and Charlene appeared. Samantha burst into tears, and George was banished to the nursery to nurse his daughter while his friend and his girlfriend comforted his ex-wife. "Women, eh, Cynthia?" said George. "Oh, wait, you're one of them too, aren't you?" "Yeah, I'm in." "Okay, but you promise me, no matter what, to always love me, okay?" "I will," Charlene said from the doorway. "George, you need to come see." With tears in her eyes, Samantha admitted that the waitressing job just wasn't working for her. The hours were long and the pay was minimal. She needed every penny of tips, and tips weren't very reliable. "So what do you want from me?" asked George. "Yes, ma'am, I'm still working. Ma'am, what if it wasn't for the Nicole King Scholarship? Man, I don't know where I'd be," Charlene babbled on her cell phone. George, I don't know," Samantha admitted, avoiding looking her ex-husband in the face. "Here, you need to talk to this woman, do you hear me?" said Charlene, placing her cell phone in Samantha's hand. "Hello." "Charlene, who is this?" said Samantha. "Hi, this is Kampala Jeffries. I'm the current chairperson of the Nicole King Scholarship. Miss Chalmers said that you are the perfect candidate to help us. As you may or may not know, all recommendations given by previous scholarship recipients are moved to the top of the list," the pleasant voice soothed. "How about 3 hours?" 3, when? What day?" asked Samantha. 3 o'clock today, Miss Luckett," laughed Kampala. "Now go home and put on something pretty. No, I'll come with you," said Charlene. "You see, by God's will, I have half a day today." While Samantha cleaned herself up and put on nice clothes, Charlene taught Samantha what to say. Finally, Charlene thought the outfit was nice enough, and Samantha's makeup was good enough. "Hello, Mrs. Jakes. Have we arrived in Kampala?" said Charlene to the receptionist as she and Samantha entered the lobby of King Sanitation. "Are you Miss Luckett?" Sheila Jakes smiled. "I'll let Mrs. Jeffries know you're here. Charlene, how are you?" "She'll see you now," Sheila told Samantha a moment later. "That's—" "I'll take her. I know where it is," Charlene said, grabbed Samantha's hand, and dragged her down the hall. "Charlene, hi," smiled the attractive African-American woman, rising to her feet. "Are you pregnant?" Charlene flinched, noticing the woman's small belly. An hour later, George looked up to see a radiant Charlene walking into his house. He rose to his feet and began to prepare dinner. "She's going to go to WooTech, that's what. She thinks she can be an administrative assistant like me," Charlene announced cheerfully. "Do I need to worry? Are you socializing with my ex-wife?" teased George. "Hey, we're both Cynthia's moms," Charlene defended herself. "We need to get along for the sake of the baby." George was stunned when Samantha burst into the house and called out to Charlene. Charlene left George in the kitchen. Samantha held out a brochure from St. Elizabeth Parish Military Technical School and excitedly showed Charlene that among the courses was childcare. She and Charlene settled down on George's couch and began to read the other options. "And I broke into your house like this? I bet you'd put a load of buckshot in my ass," thought George as he made the potato pancakes that Charlene loved so much. "Do you have enough?" asked Charlene, and George smiled. "Yes, I have enough," said George. "I'm sorry," said Samantha as they sat down to eat. "I know. Would you have broken into my house? I would have been beyond upset. But I was so excited when I saw childcare and—" "We have a doorbell," George said calmly. "And I'll use it next time," Samantha promised. "How do you always get everything so perfect?" asked Charlene. "The potatoes? He adds cream," replied Samantha. Cynthia shrieked, and George waved for both women to return to their seats. "So, when do you start?" asked George. Oh, not this Monday, but next Monday," replied Samantha. "I have to let them know my choice by this Friday so they can make sure there are seats available." "I'm sure you'll do fine," George said as he cleared the dishes off the table. "Yeah, I hope so," Samantha said, losing some of her enthusiasm. "I mean, remember? I went to UCLA for 1 semester, got 3 Ds and 1 F." "Yeah, and what did your dad say?" "Was too busy playing and studying," George agreed. "Did someone need diapers? Huh? Does anyone need a dry diaper?" fussed Charlene, taking Cynthia from Samantha's arms. George was at the sink when he felt his ex-wife's arms go around his waist. He felt her hugging him from behind, resting her head against his shoulder. "I'm so sorry," Samantha whispered. "It's okay. Just use the doorbell next time, huh?" said George. "I know, not for that," said Samantha quietly, letting him go. "Hmm?" asked George, turning slightly to look at her over his shoulder. "For everything! For everything!" Samantha wheezed and turned and ran out of George's house. George wrung out the sponge and placed it on a small wire tray in the back of the sink. He heard Samantha's car pull away. George heard Charlene singing to Cynthia as she carried the girl from the nursery to the living room. "Yeah, I'm sorry too," George said. "And I'm not sorry." As George entered the living room, Charlene looked up from her seat on the couch. The warm, happy smile she bestowed on George made him smile back. The next day, Hank and George met at the dead end for meatloaf with a choice of red or brown gravy. A very pretty strawberry blonde girl was bouncing and wriggling to some hip-hop tune, and Hank and George agreed that music wasn't the same after Chet Atkins died. "And you know, the girl has no idea who Chet Atkins is." Hank nodded his head. "Probably not," George agreed. After Hank gladly and happily gave George his blessing to ask for his little girl's hand in marriage, Hank generously paid the lunch bill. Hank shrugged when George reluctantly informed him that he couldn't get married in the Catholic Church. He was a divorced man. "Hell, it doesn't matter. We're Lutherans. Larry Elgin? Atonement Lutheran? He'll get you all married," Hank said cheerfully. When the two men left the bar, Hank was already on the phone telling Debbie the happy news. Hank and George warned Debbie to keep the happy news to herself. Charlene didn't know about the ring in George's pocket. "No, Samantha, I'm not sorry," George thought as he stopped in front of his old house to pick up Cynthia. "Hi, I was just about to call you," Samantha replied grimly, already dressed in her Casa Ol waitress uniform. "Billy just called. Monique just up and quit and left." "Good," George agreed and wrinkled his nose, looking at the squalor of his former home. The place needed a good dusting and vacuuming. The kitchen table hadn't been cleaned since breakfast. George saw the skillet on which Samantha was cooking bacon and scrambled eggs. "Yes, George, I know. The house is a total wreck," Samantha grumbled as George walked Cynthia to the door. "But you know what? You don't live here. I do live here. You don't live here anymore, George." "No, Samantha. I'm not the least bit sorry." George smiled as he buckled Cynthia into her car seat. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.